In this video, we'll revisit stories of viewer encounters with mysterious little people all over Canada, from videos we've previously published. First, we'll take a look at stories from northern Canada. In a previous video, these were lumped in with Alaskan stories, but for this video I've selected only the Canadian ones. Next, we'll take a look at stories from western Canada. And finally, we'll tackle the tales from eastern Canada. Enjoy.
First one is by Paul Sherman, 7802, 5 years ago. I worked with an Inuit woman. I sneezed once and said, "God bless all the wee folk I blowed away." She looked at me in surprise and said, "How do you know about them?" They would come to our village and steal our fish. And that's a common thing I see all the time with little people and with wild men. They steal fish from drying racks, from smokehouses, that sort of thing. That's a super, super common theme. Next one is Northwest Olympics 1630, 5 years ago. The natives along the Yukon River told me about the little people. Everyone there believes it. All I know. So Yukon River is a big river, goes from Canada's Yukon territory, flows out into Alaska. I think the terminus, like the mouth of it, is St. Michael's, Alaska. So it could be Alaska or Yukon territory. Next one's from Sharon Weir, 8513, 1 year ago. I'm from Nunavut, and throughout my life I've heard of the legends of the giants and the little people. My grandparents and mom are from the Black River region, on Chantry Inlet. No one has any idea how vast the tundra truly is until you're here. I sometimes wonder if there are still Inuit living as nomads to this day. Okay, next one. Jerry Weiss, 5 years ago. When I had worked in the eastern Canadian Arctic at a place called Broughton Island, some of the local Inuit had told me about some of their ancestors. These ancestors were supposedly very small, yet very strong. I believe that they called them the Thule, or Thule. And that's another common theme with these little people. They're always wrestlers, or very often they're wrestlers, and they challenge humans to wrestling matches in these old native stories, and they're extremely strong. And on that subject, there was a subscriber who got in touch with me, but it was like a third-hand story, but he ended up corroborating it with the guy who it happened to. So technically a first-hand story of a guy, like a native, like I think a Cree native from northern Winnipeg, northern Manitoba, who, like on the northern end of Lake Winnipeg, had encountered one of these things in the bush while he was basically hanging out with some friends, just drinking beer by the fire. And he was kind of an irreverent guy, didn't really respect his ancestral traditions, and so he kicked this thing, and he says it was like a rock, and the thing grabbed his pants, and he like barely managed to escape, something like that. You gotta watch the video. I'll link to that in the description. But yeah, they're always very strong, like way stronger than you'd think they'd be. Next one's Aunt Just Given Her, 4 years ago. Auntie Just Given Her, 4 years ago. I think little people are real up in the north, because 2 teachers that I know quite well has had experiences / seen them before, and one of them took pictures of their little tiny feet all around their house in the winter time. Interesting. Next one's Boxcar Willie, 3560, 5 years ago. What's a fascinating rabbit hole to go down is the pygmies battle with the giant cranes. I'm a collector of old maps, and I was very pleased to run across your channel. Thank you for taking the time to enlighten those who care to listen. So he's referring to, I can't remember which one this is, maybe like the Mercator map or something. It might be the Mercator map. It's from, I think, the 1500s, and there's a map of the North Pole, and there's pygmies on it, and right next to them are cranes. I think in one of my videos, I misinterpreted this as storks or something, but yeah, they're cranes, and the legend is that the pygmies would battle with the cranes, and correct me if I'm wrong, I might be wrong about this. I feel like that comes from Pliny the Elder, but I could be wrong. But anyway, in old maps from the 1500s of the North Pole, there were pygmies that were supposed to battle with cranes. Next one is Baseline 5633, 5 years ago. Thank you for the information, and I perceive that the tale of small elves in the north is a result of 2 separate tales. For one, there's definitely a Viking story on short men in the New World. However, tales of elves actually began with the Albus or Alban people, who migrated into northern Europe from the north of the Black Sea. They were actually said to be tall in stature, fair, beautiful, with pointed ears. It is said in some anthropology circles that the Alban, along with the Alon peoples, were Indo-European in origin, which could make sense when considering their stature. Yet their names are Semitic, and that is the peculiar part. So then somehow, some way, the 2 tales must have intertwined. After all this, I would like to make clear that I'm not claiming a pygmy or dwarven race did not exist. Some tribes claim they were accompanied by pygmy and giant races in their folklore, such as the New Zealander indigenous, several or more North American tribes, yeah, that's an understatement, and Hindu Valley peoples. So it's possible that the Nords encountered smaller Inuit, and Inuit encountered smaller people than them. It does say that in the Viking sagas. I think it's the Greenlander saga. They have the Norse Vikings who came to the Americas had a battle with they call the Skralingjar, which are like I think natives, but they said they were short in stature. So I don't know if that just means like shorter than the Vikings were, or were they really short? And I think in the saga of Eric the Red, which is the same story, but I think it was written maybe 100 years later or something like that, the Skralingjar live in holes in the ground, which is a common theme in northern little people stories. They live in the ground or in the mountains, in holes and caves. I don't know much about the Alban people. I don't know anything about that, so I won't comment on that. I don't know if there's any connection to this, but I know that the old name for Britain, the Isle of Britain, is Albion. That's one of the old names for it. I don't know if there's a connection with the Alban people or not. Next one is Perceive 9600, 1 year ago. I was working on Baffin Island a few years ago. Early one morning, I happened to wake up and open my eyes. In that exact moment, the door to my Quonset-style tent popped open. There was nothing defective about the door upon inspection, and I could not recreate it. Kind of a boring story, but my sixth sense was telling me it was little people out on the barren tundra. Also, the old Hudson's Bay trading post in Iqaluit is very noisy at night, like someone is in there still, taking inventory, and going about the post's operations. Interesting, so an Iqaluit ghost story. Iqaluit is the tiny little capital of Nunavut, which is the easternmost of the 3 northern territories in Canada. And that's the first Iqaluit story about anything unusual I've ever heard, which is pretty neat. Next one is Gina Fournier, 5330, 1 year ago. A youngster went missing on our res in northern Canada for a week, and then suddenly showed back up at home, clean and no worse for wear. When asked where she had been, and with who, she told her parents the little people took care of her and brought her back home. She said they were in the mountain caves. That's a super common story from Newfoundland where people will go missing and then they'll show up, no worse for wear, little kids. Actually, that's not true, not no worse for wear. A lot of times physically and mentally they're really messed up, and they'll say the little people will have taken them. But in a few stories, people return unharmed, especially if they're little girls. I've read maybe 3 stories about that, with little girls who will go missing, lost in the woods, like way too young to take care of themselves, and will be returned to their home, as if somebody had been taking care of them, and they're no worse for wear, and they would say the little people took care of them. And the detail about the mountain caves is interesting because that is like the northern Cree. They said that they lived in the mountains. I'm sorry, that's not right. The Cree said they lived on the top of, like in caves and on riverside cliffs and lakeside cliffs and stuff. I think the mountain thing is a Dene thing. And it's also a Stony thing, unrelated. Stony from the Rocky Mountains. Next one is Curtis X. Curtis, 1 year ago. I live in northern Canada. I've never seen a little person, but I've seen evidence of little people. There is a small island near my hometown. On that island has a very small cave that goes into the island. On the beach of that island I saw a set of very small footprints. About 1 inch ahead of each footprint were toenails digging into the sand that lead to a very small cave opening. The cave opening was less than 2 feet tall, and the footprints were about 5 inches long. Interesting. So we're going to start in the west in British Columbia, the westernmost of Canada's provinces. This comment's from Brennan Clarahan, 2288, 2 years ago. I've seen the little people camping along a river near Kelowna. We set up a tent and fire, and they came behind firelight, and 4 of them and a 2 to 2 foot tall with eyes that were like 3 inches wide. Only thing similar is a lemur, and those don't live in BC. I went to the car and got an axe. My Mexican date asked me what they were, and I just brushed it off. So let me read that again. They came behind firelight, and 4 of them and a 1 foot to 2 feet tall, with eyes that were like 3 inches wide. So big eyes, little people. Now, Kelowna is in the Okanagan on Okanagan Lake, and there are certainly little people stories from the Okanagan Indians. So that definitely jives with old regional folklore. If you want to see my video on the interior Salish little people legends, I'll include that, a link to my video on that in the description. Next comment's Mark Nile, 7225, 2 years ago. I saw two different kinds of fairy folk near Sicamous, BC. One was greenish-gray color and about a foot high and looked like the little demons. The little demons. They wore clothing that blended in with the bush. The other looked at us, about foot to 14 inches high, and wore bright clothes, reds, green, purple, etc. One day I was working on a train. We were parked in the siding waiting for a train to pass, and in field across from the tracks I saw beautiful girls. They were in long white nightgowns with flowers in their blonde hair. In a headband fashion. They were picking wild strawberries. They looked around 18 or 19 years old. They came up to the fence by the tracks and wanted me to come over so they could check me out. But sadly I couldn't leave my post. I wanted to go with them so badly that it hurt, but I could not. I don't know if they were fairy folk or ghosts, and I often think what would have happened if I went with them that day. I went back the next day and asked the people that owned the field. They did not know who they were or who I was talking about. Strange things indeed. So Sicamous is in the same kind of general area as Kelowna. It's further to the north. And I'm not sure what to make of the beautiful women. That is just like some Hulda-folk stories from Iceland and New Iceland that I've read about. New Iceland is in Manitoba, west of Lake Winnipeg. A lot of the Hulda-folk stories, Hulda-folk means hidden people in Icelandic, and they're just, I don't think they're always portrayed as little people. They're just kind of like elves, like hidden people. They're supposed to live in rocks. And there's a story that I covered from Iceland about a guy, a young man, coming upon these beautiful girls who vanished into the mist. So it sounds like that's different from the first thing he saw. That was a greenish-gray color and about a foot high. And looked like demons, whatever that is. Okay, next one's Medusa Energy 1 year ago. While camping, my dad said fairies lived in those little moss houses around us. We were in the mountains, British Columbia. I didn't believe him, but for some reason it felt like I should leave these alone. Some kids were destroying them, and these kids were kind of evil their whole lives, so I don't know if the fairies made them suffer after or before. Next comment's Crusader Survivor 3 years ago. When I was about 10, camping with my family in northwestern BC, I was on a hillside with a bunch of purple flowers. I remember seeing a boy with purple hair sitting among the purple flowers. When he noticed me, he beckoned me with his hand to come play with him. I was just about to, and I heard my mom calling for me. And when I turned my head to look back at the boy, he wasn't anywhere I could see. I didn't think anything about it for decades, until I saw this video, and thought maybe the boy with purple hair I saw was one of these little people. I'm glad I didn't follow him. His kind face could have been a subterfuge of malice and ill will. So that's the first story I've heard of a little person with purple hair, or hair that's a weird color. Next comment's Rod Zor 2 years ago. I went for a walk one time in the woods in the evening, and next to a tree well off the trail, left my handprint deeply imprinted in the snow. Early the next morning, which was December 21st, 2019, I went back after the night. There was a light dusting of snow, so my handprint was slightly covered, but next to it, there was a clear, deep, fresh imprint with palm lines and everything, of a small child-sized hand, right next to my hand. The weirdest thing was that in the snow around it, and nowhere to be found, were there footprints of anything. No animals, no people, nothing. It just seemed to form out of thin air. I did take pics, and it still baffles me. No one else had been out there. This was in British Columbia. That's a creepy story. Next comment's Kevin Schindler, 9425, 1 year ago. Nocturnal, dark-skinned people live around Powell River and Comox Valley area. They eat dead roadkill. We have seen them many times, running into the woods, from beside road ditches. They eat dead animals killed by cars, deer mostly. I've only seen female little people, no males, naked and strange to see. So the dark skin is a theme that I've seen a few times in, there's a story from the Stony in the Rocky Mountains, Alberta's Rocky Mountains, of like little people with black skin. And there's another story, which I think is like Algonquin or like it's some sort of Anishinaabe or something, from Ontario, of people with dark skin. I've done videos on both of those, and I'll include them in the description. And just for context, Powell River is like a very, very nice little town on the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia. You have to take a ferry to get there, a couple ferries to get there. And the Comox Valley is like right across the Georgia Strait, or the Salish Sea, on Vancouver Island, on the, would have been the eastern shores of Vancouver Island. Next comment's Mayrish Carr 1 year ago. So glad to find something on little people. We encountered one on Silver Creek, BC. We're standing on my mom's second-floor patio where my mom had draped an old Hudson's Bay blanket across the railing and was explaining the points sewn into the material when my eye was drawn to movement. I looked into the field, and a small man, maybe 4 feet tall at most, was walking through the grass looking down as if searching for something he'd lost. I said, "Who is that?" to my mom, and she looked but couldn't see him. I then called my friend, and she could also see him. The little man heard us shouting and looked our way, and then hid behind a small, low bush and played peekaboo with us. Wanting a closer look, but also nervous, we got into my car and drove the 150 meters to where he was hiding, in a bush-covered dirt mound in the middle of a field, and he had totally vanished, and there were no footprints. This was in daylight, Labor Day weekend of 2015, and I was not under the influence of anything. So where's Silver Creek, BC? Okay, so it looks like it's in the northern Okanagan Valley, incidentally kind of halfway between Kelowna, not halfway between, but between Kelowna and Sicamous, where 2 of our stories took place. I think at the end of this I'm going to have to do a map with the different points plotted on it, just to see where everything happened. Next comments, Rod Zor 1 year ago. Awesome. I live in the Thompson-Okanagan area near Kamloops. The only thing I've had happen, one of the weirdest, coolest things, is one time on a forest trail I was hiking in the evening, and in some fresh snow off the trail, under a tree, I splayed my fingers out, and left my handprint clear in the snow. Oh, this is the same guy as before. Well, let's read it anyways. The next morning early, I went for another hike. No one else had been out there, and it's off the trail a bit. I remember it was December 21st, 2019. There was a light dusting of snow overnight, so when I got back to that location, the handprint I had left, and my footprints and everything else had all been covered with a light dusting of snow, so there were no fresh prints from anything there. No one had been there, but right under the handprint that I had left was the smallest child-sized hand, freshly pushed into the snow, right up against and below my palm. It was maybe half the size or slightly more than the 1/3 of the size of my hand. I don't have big hands, and you could see palm lines and everything. The thing is that there were no footprints anywhere. No animals, no boot prints. No footprints, just nothing. It was like it was pressed into the snow from thin air. I took pictures and still just stare at them sometimes, because you have to understand someone pressing their hand into the snow would leave tracks, and there were none. So one thing this story strikes me a little bit, maybe it's a ghost story. There are ghost stories like that, where ghosts will leave a little sign like that. Or maybe it's a little person's story. But either way, very creepy. Next comment's the Checkweed Chad 1 year ago. Fascinating video. I work as a professional archaeologist, and I used to live and work in the Fort St. John/Fort Nelson area of northern BC, the traditional homeland of the Dinétsa or Beaver First Nations. We would sometimes have representatives of these nations, often elders, join us while we performed our work. Several elders from the Prophet River First Nation had told me how a section of their reserve lands, dominated by low rocky hills amidst all the boreal swampland, was the homeland of mischievous and malevolent little men. They also told me that they would always warn against members of their nation voyaging out into those hills to hunt, lest they be stolen away into the realm of the little people. The connections to other folklore you mentioned in this piece are fascinating. Would love to hear you discuss some beaver and slavey Dinétsa stories in future videos. Dinétsa legend of Wet'suwet'en is particularly unique and scary. I have done a video on the Wet'suwet'en, which I made after this comment was made. I'll link to that in the description in case you're interested in watching it. Wet'suwet'en is like clearly related to the Wendigo legend, but it's fundamentally different. A man-eating spirit that can possess people. So that's interesting that they can. The elders would warn against people going out there because they'd get stolen away by these little people. That is like the most common theme. All in every continent, little people want to steal you. If you go into their lair, into the woods, they will trick you, lure you, and take you to their abode, from which you can't escape. So strange to find that in, Europe and in northern British Columbia, everywhere. So weird. Next comment's Mark Twain 368 1 year ago. He's left some very kind comments, which I appreciate. I've encountered gnomes and elves in Vancouver's local parks. To be honest, I was under the influence of LSD at the time, but rather than mere mental hallucinations, I am certain these things were real beings on a higher vibration, or frequency, that the psychedelic drug permitted me to access. In short, I saw what is quite real, but beyond normal perception. And that's the thing I've heard before with people who do hallucinogenics, and you've heard about the DMT clockwork elves. People will go on these drugs and they will have these experiences that seem so real to them that they're convinced that these drugs are somehow allowing them to peer through the veil at some other dimension, for lack of a better word. I really hate that word. But it kind of adds another facet to the prism through which we view reality, and it allows you to see into the invisible world. If you've had your own experiences like that, please let me know in the comments. Next comments, Manly Joe Desjardins, 7568, 1 year ago. I've seen little people in the middle of the night next to a creek in Mission, BC. I was next to a little fire, and all by myself, then I seen them. They were standing completely still. Almost like that if they were completely still, I couldn't see them, but I can see them clearly. I left after about 2 minutes of looking at them, realizing what I was looking at. There were 4 or 5 of them. This was 3 years ago. I don't live there anymore, and I never went there again at night. They did have hats on, pointy ones. They looked like little garden gnomes at the time. I remember thinking that when I was looking at them. Now, if you're not familiar with fairy lore, that might sound kind of crazy, but that is one of the common themes that is kind of ubiquitous in especially European little people stories. They wear pointy red hats, just like they're so often depicted in artwork and like the garden gnomes. Next comments, Rick Horedsi V8Z, 6 months ago. Among the Pacific Northwest Indian tribes is the legends of little people. I haven't heard about them in 30 years, but I remember my elders would talk about them from time to time. Quinault tribe, Queets tribe, Whole River tribe, and the Quileutes all had legends about them. Even as late as 1989, Indian people would see them. He's right, that's true. There's lots of legends from the Northwest Coast about them. I'll include my video on kind of native little people stories in the description. All across the country, not just the Northwest Coast. Next comments, Conjoyce 5207, 7 months ago. My girlfriend and I came face to face with a little person in the bush near Kelowna, BC, August 1977. And strangely, the being we saw, it's the little people that lived in the Kettle Valley area. You mentioned this in the video. I can't recall what she's referring to, but another story from Kelowna. Let me just check out what she's referring to. The only reference to the Kettle Valley that I can see in my work is the assassination of Peter Vasilievich Varagin, who was a leader of the Doukhobors. That was like a kind of a Russian cult, offshoot of the Orthodox Church, I think. They ended up settling in kind of the Slocan Valley, which is in real deep southern interior British Columbia, kind of north of Idaho. Doukhobors were famous for doing protests in the nude, and I think they did some arson, if memory serves. But anyway, the leader of them was assassinated in, it says here, October 29th, 1924, and his assassination has never been solved, so that's one of the weird Canadian mysteries that I covered in my video on the mysteries of the Kootenay Rockies, which I'll link to in the description as well. Next comment, Skull Venner, 1 year ago. I grew up in a log cabin on Van Isle, Vancouver Island, and these little buggers were always around. Very rarely noticed outside, but I'd catch them watching me from behind objects and around corners regularly. I never told anyone. I have one very detailed story from Vancouver Island encounter with little people that I've included in, it's a video that's actually kind of popular right now for some reason, I don't know why, on subscriber encounters with little people in Canada. I'll link to that in the description too. But there seems to be kind of 2 hotspots, at least from the personal stories that people have told me. One of them is like Vancouver Island, and another one is Ontario, like southern Ontario. But anyway, let's keep going. Next comments, BC 4198, 1 year ago. Washington State First Nations people also have little people traditions, living in certain places along the Hood Canal and Columbia River, among others. And I've heard several versions of the braiding horsemanes at night story, reportedly from all over the world. So I didn't know that the Washington natives had that, but I'm not surprised. And the braiding horsemanes at night story, that's like, I've covered this in other videos. This is a phenomenon where people will, their horses will have these delicate, intricate braids that can't be undone in their hair at night. And there's all sorts of theories for what causes it. It's one of these weird universal folk tales where people will notice a strange phenomenon. All over the world, they'll notice this phenomenon, but they can't explain it. And so there's different folkloric explanations for what causes it. Next comments, Victor Seymour, 4979, 5 months ago. Great stories. Here in the west coast of British Columbia, on the Coast Salish First Nations peoples, traditional lands and waters, there are legends, stories, etc. Here as well are the little people, told by the local elders, but you can't tell kids today anything. I've seen the little people footprints myself in a beach, but I heard that they're up on the Sacred Mountains as well. Just like Sasquatch, they are alive and well here on Vancouver Island. Like I said, it's a storytelling from the elders on how long they've been here, and I believe them and all the stories, legends of the little people, and the Sasquatch. I'm not sure what the Sacred Mountains are, but I know there's basically like kind of one mountain range right in the center of Vancouver Island. Maybe that's what he's referring to. And I know that there are all sorts of native legends about what lives in those mountains. I think they were regarded as very dangerous, holy, full of paranormal energy, I guess. And interestingly, I know he's very controversial, but David Politis, the Missing 411 guy, has, in his book, Missing 411 Canada, 2019 book, he noticed that a lot of people seem to go missing in those mountains. And so they're one of his clusters, as he calls them. Anyway, kind of an interesting coincidence. Next comments, Caleb Chaff Official 5 months ago. Ontarian here. I've seen a little person. I was on magic mushrooms. It scared the hell out of me. I said to my partner in my confusion and panic, would you kill a little person? So another psychedelic story. Next comments, Marish Carr 5 months ago. My friend and I saw a little person in Silver Creek, BC in full daylight in 2015. Is this the same person who commented before? It is, okay, so another description of the encounter in Silver Creek. Let's just finish it here. He was looking down and walking through grass as if he lost something. Then he noticed us looking at, pointing at, and discussing him. Then he hid behind the bushes and played peekaboo with us until we went to where he was, and then he vanished. No tracks in the dirt at all. He was maybe 4 to 4.5 feet. Okay, now we're moving into Alberta. And the first comment's from Louise Posdick, 7527, 3 years ago. At another time, I parked at a bank on White Avenue in Edmonton. As I came around the corner, I saw a very short man about 4 feet in height, who was dressed in a very long brown coat that had the long tails of the 1700s. His footwear appeared to be of about the same century. On his head was a fur hat. He was looking at a small piece of paper. He looked up at me and became very nervous, and fiddled with the paper. I nodded to him, and he quickly walked past me. I turned around to see where he was going, and he had disappeared. The day was the 26th of December, 2008. And it looks like Louise Posdick has another story. She says, I was living in the city of Edmonton and driving to take my dog to the groomer to have his toenails clipped. As I neared a church, I slowed down, as I knew there was a frost heave on the street. Out from a light standard popped a short, 3.5-foot man in black clothing and a black pointy hat over his very curly black hair. He carried a parcel in his hand and skip-hopped across the street, without his feet touching the ground towards a mail delivery van. My dog put his front paws on the dash and watched the whole thing without barking. I wondered at that time if the little man knew he had needed stamps on his parcel. When he reached the postal van, he disappeared. So it sounds like that's a different story. 2 different events in Edmonton. White Avenue is a very, very busy avenue. Next comments, Charles Wegg, 4858, 1 year ago. I'm from the Blackfoot Piikani Nation. One time when I was younger, my dad woke me up from sleeping. I just went to sleep, and he had told me he was sleeping outside in the back of his truck. It was summertime, very hot. He went inside the house to get a drink of water, and then heard them talking in Blackfoot, teasing him. He ran at them, and lightning speed they both ran into the basement, calling him. That's when he woke me up. He said they had long gray hair, glowing gray eyes, and they were 2 feet high with big hands. Interesting, so a house story. Long gray hair and glowing gray eyes. And they spoke Blackfoot. That's an interesting story. Next comment, Stan, 6243, 1 year ago. I swear I had an encounter with one of these little folk in Drumheller. I came from Calgary to do a roofing job, and as I was driving back into town, I saw something about the size of a large prairie dog by the road. I didn't pay it any mind, because I was more worried about deer on the road, but it looked like it did a little dance and threw something. A moment later, a beer bottle smashed on the front of my vehicle. Little bastard, I exclaimed. That's when I looked directly at it, as it turned to run into the ditch. It looked like a little man wearing a chicken feather vest. I told a local at the liquor store what had happened, and he told me that it was Drumheller's little bastard, which bemused me as I had not told him I had called the creature exactly that. The next day I did pick up at the Boston Pizza for supper, and they had a little gnome statue in the dining area. I asked the server why, and she said that the little folk are territorial, and the only way to keep them out of the dumpster is to make them think one was already on the premises with a statue. I hate working out of town. What? That's funny. So just like how you put like a owl statue to scare the birds away. So Drumheller is like a city in like northeast of Calgary, pretty close to the Saskatchewan border. And it's famous for like being in the Badlands. It has all these cool hoodoos and stuff. And it's I guess more famous for way back in the I guess late 1800s, early 1900s. They found a bunch of dinosaur bones there in the Badlands. And pretty close to Drumheller is the Royal Tyrrell Museum, which is a very cool museum with a bunch of dinosaur skeletons that have been, I guess, dug up in the area. So Drumheller is a hotspot for little people. I didn't know that. Something interesting is that some of the native legends from Alberta, Saskatchewan, say that little people live in, I think this is more a Plains Cree thing than a Blackfoot thing, but they say the little people live in the Great Sandhills, which is like in southwest Saskatchewan, this big area. It looks like the Sahara Desert. There's these big mounds of sand. And the Blackfoot said this was the land of the dead. This is where if you died and you were like a warrior, I think, this is the place where if you died, your spirit would go there if you were an Indian. And they'd hear phantom horses riding around at night, stuff like that. But I think the Plains Cree legends say that this area is a home for little people. And I've done a video on that before. But the Great Sandhills kind of remind you a little bit of the Badlands because it's just this weird area, very arid, not a lot of water. Nothing really grows there except for cactuses and very sparse grass, I guess. So the two areas are kind of similar. They remind you of each other. So I don't know if there's any native legends about little people in the Badlands, but I wouldn't be surprised. Next comment's way too faded, 420, 11 months ago. I was volunteering for a Native Youth Center in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, literally today, December 12, 2024. And the cultural advisor, whose name I cannot disclose, was a Cree elder with a vast knowledge. He told me how in his youth he was hunting in southern Alberta in the prairies, and he watched two of them dart across the trail 50 yards from him and disappear into a jut of rocks. So another interesting story from southern Alberta. Next comment's War Squigs painting 3 months ago. It ain't just Ontario. It was January 2018, during that minus 50 cold snap here in Alberta. It's near 3 a.m. and I'm outside having a cigarette. Yeah, I think only Canadians will have a cigarette in minus 50-degree weather. That's pretty intense. I heard this, chirping like a bird. I thought the yard light had woken up a chickadee or something. Then I hear what sounds like talons tapping on metal. It's 3 a.m., so no bird should be up. It's deathly cold, at minus 48 at 3 a.m. Nothing should be up and moving. So I'm looking around to see what's making this noise, and as I turn to look to another portion of the roof, this thing flies by me. It was about 1 foot tall, had a bluish-white color for skin tone, white hair that refracted like diamonds, and wings that looked like those of a dragonfly. Its teeth were sharp and pointed, and its eyes the purest black. It flew within 2 feet of my head, hissing as it passed me. I have no history of family mental illness, nor am I schizophrenic. I have no history of visual hallucinations, and I am in fine medical health. But I saw a 1 foot tall flying blue creature with black eyes, shark-like teeth, and dragonfly-like wings. The kicker? I told a friend who was into this face stuff. She pulled a book out from the early 1900s, some tome published in Britain about fairies. The thing was in this book as an ice spirit, some form of fae that are seen during cold snaps and in the dead of winter. Well, that certainly checks the hell out. I'm not crazy, but I saw a fae creature in 2018. And it actually kind of broke my perception of reality. What else is there in the folklore of man that still lives and breathes today? That is a really interesting story. I don't know anything about the ice spirit in British folklore. Maybe I'll just look it up quickly, see if I can find anything. So the first thing that comes up is, I'm not going to pronounce this right, but this is like Caoleek. This is Wikipedia. In Gaelic, Irish, Scottish, and Manx myth, the Caoleek is a divine hag associated with the creation of the landscape and with the weather, especially storms in winter. The word literally means old woman, hag, and is found within this meaning in modern Irish and Scottish Gaelic, and has been applied to numerous mythological and folkloric figures in Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. In modern Irish folklore studies, she is sometimes known as the Hag of Beara, while in Scotland she is known as Beara, Queen of Winter. So I don't know if there's any connection between this and the ice spirit that the commenter mentioned, but anyway, interesting. Let's continue. So now we're going into Saskatchewan. And the first comment's from Brooks, SG8ZD, 4 years ago. I'm a First Nation native. My mom from northern Saskatchewan, Canada, always told me stories of little people. Her parents and grandparents told the same story. Don't believe they're fairies, but an ancient humanoid civilization, perhaps. Pretty interesting video. Next comment's Leo Davis, 1 year ago. My ex-wife is Indigenous and grew up in Saskatchewan and around the Qu'Appelle Valley. She told me many stories of the little people, personal experiences as well as some others she's heard. This was back in the early 90s. She told me these encounters. It was common in her community to hear these stories. Every now and then, when I go back to her home area, I still hear stories. Elders used to talk about them with great respect and fear. To this day, I know they are not tales, but they are very real. So the Qu'Appelle Valley is a very nice area in, I think it's southeastern Saskatchewan, and maybe a little bit of Manitoba, maybe I'm making that up. But it's, I think, a historic stomping grounds of the Cree, Plains Cree, and also, after the Red River Rebellion in the 1860s, that's when Louis Riel, Canada's famous rebel, Métis rebel, Métis people are, I'm actually part Métis. They're kind of a hybrid people born from mostly French-Canadian fur traders and like Cree, mostly Cree and Ojibwe and Saulteaux Indians, women. Some of them are descended from Scottish fur traders, which is what my side of the family's, my mom's side of the family's from. But it's mostly French-Canadian and Native women. But they, under the leadership of Louis Riel, he was kind of a prophet, maybe, if you believe that, or crazy person, who led a rebellion in the 1860s when the Canadian government was trying to survey the land that the Métis people had lived on, and they didn't want to lose their homes. So they had a little rebellion. I don't think anybody was killed except for this one guy. He was a prisoner and was kind of causing trouble, and I think they executed him, more just to show the government that they were serious. I don't think the execution was really warranted at all. But I think because of that, the Canadian army or militia marched out west with a fairly large force, and there was no fighting. I think Riel fled to the United States and stayed there until in the 1880s he came back and had the Northwest Rebellion, which was a real rebellion. I guess Canada, Western Canada's version of the Civil War. Very small affair compared to the Civil War. But anyways, where was I going with this? The point I wanted to make was that after the Red River Rebellion, that was the one in the 1860s, a lot of Métis kind of left their historic haunts on the Red River, which is in Manitoba, south of Lake Winnipeg, and they went into the Qu'Appelle Valley. So it's very, very Métis there. Anyway, I'm digressing. Let's go to the next one. Melissa Watsky, 3835, 1 year ago. My brother attended St. Michael Residential School in Saskatchewan and said that the staff would talk about seeing the little people around the grounds of the school when working outside, just like the staff say in this video. So this is in response to, I think it's on my video on Rocky Mountain Legends, but there's stories that the staff of the Stoney Reservation would see little people running around the school. Anyway, let's continue. My late Kokum had attended the same school, but I'm not sure if she heard anything. She told my late mom the name of them, but she also said it's not good to talk about them and to give them respect and that they live near water and can walk into the ground. My cousin said she saw one in her room on the res one night when she was a young child. Another of my cousins also said she saw one outside the porta-potty while waiting for her mom. I was staying in a hotel with her and her mom for the Indigenous Summer Games at Big River that time. I asked her what the little person looked like. She said the little person was an old man with a very wrinkly face, and the way she described it, looking at her, kind of freaked me out at the time. I was 10 or 11 years old at the time. It was very unnerving. But yes, they exist on the Saskatchewan plains. Some elders explained to my cousin that she was to put ribbon and marbles in the bushes as an offering to them because they like those. Oh, and some people say they may take things, specifically shiny items, because they are said to like shiny items. Another time, me and a few other people were out at Bear Ass Beach, just outside of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, enjoying ourselves, and it was getting late. As we were visiting, it was becoming to get pitch black outside, just the moon and stars in the sky. There was a little fire in the bushes that started out of thin air. It was about 50 feet away, directly in the bushes, and it was contained to that little area. Obviously, someone was taking care of that little fire, and knew what they were doing, because the bushes above and around it didn't go up in flames. We were super shocked, and we left shortly after this. I haven't been out there since. Wow, those are very cool stories. I'll say that the wrinkly face of an old man is the same thing that I covered a story set in Alaska, I think. and some people saw a little person in the bush, and it was also described as an old-looking person with a very wrinkly face. And wrinkles are another thing that, in Newfoundland, the fairy stories, some people say that the fairies are supposed to look like very old people. So that's not a universal motif. A lot of times they look like young people, very fair-looking, but in other stories they're very ancient-looking. But anyway, very cool stories from Saskatchewan. Next comment's Calby Sean 4571, 10 months ago. The first story reminds me of my bro. One night, in an area about 9 kilometers from Sandy Bay, Saskatchewan, he and his friends were having a drink. They were approached by little people. They offered tobacco and then took off. He quit drinking for some time after his experience that night. So that's interesting because in another story I covered from northern Manitoba, an encounter with a little person led to the person who had that experience quitting alcohol. So let me just find out, where's Sandy Bay, Saskatchewan? I don't know. Oh, so that's way up north, pretty close to the Manitoba border, deep in the boreal forest. Fair distance north of Flin Flon, which is pretty remote. Okay, let's keep going. This one's from Pomeranian 7, 5 months ago. I'm from Plains Cree territory. Thank you for collecting and telling these stories. Not only are they very spooky, but I imagine not a lot of people are even aware we have so many mysterious folk tales. Few are written down, and if you have no connections to those who know the stories, you are unlikely to hear them. I've heard a few interesting tales myself from elders within Sweetgrass First Nation, about mermaids in Manitou Lake near Neilburg, little people, and Stekini. Since I love scary stories, I quite enjoy these oral tales, and jump at the chance to hear more. I think it's important for others to take interest and make records of them for future listeners. Oral tradition is important, but we can help keep that alive by passing on the stories in other methods. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's what I tried to do here. So the Sweetgrass First Nation, I guess it's from the Sweetgrass Hills, which is in northern Montana, pretty close to right across the Milk River from Riding on Stone Provincial Park in southern Alberta. But let's just find out where's Manitou Lake near Neilburg. Oh, I'm wrong. That's just dead in Saskatchewan. Pretty close to the Alberta border near Lloydminster, just south of Lloydminster, and east of North Battleford. So I guess the Sweetgrass Nation must be in the same area, not the Sweetgrass Hills. Okay, I gotta put that in my mermaid folder. Manitou Lake, Saskatchewan. Our last Saskatchewan story is from Leona Dubois 249, 5 months ago. I've been dealing with these little people in my small acreage in Saskatchewan. They lock up my chickens, sheep, and goats in their barns, and take my things and return them months later and other things. And that's a super common theme. They're tricksters. They'll play tricks on people. They'll take their things and then return it for no apparent reason, half a year later or something. That's a really common theme in Manitoba, Holderfolk stories, and in Newfoundland fairy stories. And now we're into Manitoba. First comment's from Jaw Breed 4 years ago. This is a very long-time commenter. Yes, the little people. They are black in color and move ridiculously swiftly. They are not friendly at all. Northern Manitoba. I was even shown where they live in that region. No kidding. It is a cliffside that is only easily accessible by boat. One of the strangest things I've seen. As you approach it off the Nelson River, you can see it's uneven with dark spots, roughly resembling a steep staircase. Up close, those dark spots are rectangular holes cut into the cliff, peppered along these stairs, descending from the densely treed top. Doorways. It's protected and feared by the locals. If you can find one, a Kimuk can tell you all about them. If you're lucky, fast enough, and can handle sitting in one place, you might catch a look at one. They like to steal things. Very interesting. And northern Manitoba is woodland Cree country, swampy Cree country too. And the Cree little people stories almost always say that the little people live inside cliffs, riverside cliffs. So this totally checks out with that. Next comment's George Kyler, 7563, 2 years ago. I see the little people all the time, and I also see them in my dreams. My friend in Manitoba has 5 living in his house, and he gives them trinkets so they don't harm him or anyone else. Another friend has one that follows her around, even to her workplace, but I don't think she's aware of them. Not all little people are dangerous. I now live back in my home province of British Columbia, and still see them. Boy, do they love the smell of yellow cedar. The next time I'm at our carving shack, I'll smudge the shack before inviting them in. Next comment's Whirlwind MN 1 year ago. Cheers from Manitoba. I grew up just north of Winnipeg, and have had several encounters with a little person 1 to 2 times a year, until I was in my teens. He showed up in spring and fall. I had one final encounter with him 10 years later. He was friendly and scary at the same time. There's a few stories like that of people who have kind of, for lack of a better word, like a pet little person. And most of these stories that I've received on my channel are concentrated in a folder I have on, I call it domestic stories. So we'll hopefully do that in a future video. But let's go to the next one. Is this the last one? It is. The last one from Manitoba and the last one from Western Canada. From Greasy JH 10 months ago. We have little people in northern Manitoba. We call them Mamagwese. I didn't realize how they were all across Canada. They have lots of stories, not just stories, but it is real, because they were seen lots of times when I grew up. I hear lots of stories, and I'm 41 years old now. First comments from James Warner, 7435, 5 years ago. I have a friend from Northwest Ontario who has shared some stories of the little people, and they are much as described here. His uncle lived by himself, far out in the bush, and as the uncle reached old age, his family began to wonder how he was able to perform all the physically strenuous tasks required to survive the area's very long, cold winters. And so when a few family members came to stay with the old man for several days one summer, they were amazed to discover that this old man, who was now unable to walk without a cane, had somehow already cut, split, and stacked the many cords of firewood needed to last the coming winter in his small cabin. As it turned out, the uncle had all the help he needed to survive out in the wilderness, because his helper was not human like you or I. He was one of these elf-like little men. The tribe's oral tradition goes back many centuries, with most of their legends describing these little men as extremely capable, almost magical, not necessarily malevolent, but mostly devious tricksters. Not knowing just what to make of the situation, the uncle's family unpacked the various gifts they had brought, and decided they must leave immediately, but not before reminding the uncle that befriending these beings was regarded as dangerous and taboo. Seeming almost relieved at the news of their departure, the uncle acknowledged the warning and expressed his fear that even though he himself had become accepted by the little men, he could not guarantee the other family members' safety had they decided to stay. From what my friend so kindly shared with me over the years on this topic, it was around the time the very first European settlers started coming to North America, and the little men decided to cut off all direct contact with human beings, unless it was absolutely necessary. And the natives and little men have distrusted each other ever since. That is a perfect little story that is just like the sort of thing you find in ethnology. And the idea that the little people kind of stopped interacting with certain First Nations or Native Americans is actually a theme I recall from, I can't remember which anthropologist this was, but I think it was Granville Lake. It was the Rock Cree, I think, in northern Manitoba. And I want to say it was Robert Brightman's work, but I could be wrong. But there's one story, I've covered it in a different video, which I'll link in the description, where there was a certain relationship between certain natives and the little people, which ended when white people came to the area because I guess they acted in a way that the little people didn't like, maybe like cutting down trees and building structures and things like that. The little people didn't like it for some reason, and they decided to end their relationship with the natives in the area. Let's check out the next comment. A girl has no name, 1422, 5 years ago. I swear to God, when I was a child, my cousins live right on Lake Ontario in Oakville, which is 30 minutes away from Toronto. We would spend every weekend there, and my cousins had a small balcony off their bedroom, with a tree against the balcony. At night, we would see these small, 2-foot little men that would sit in the tree and watch us. I wasn't scared by them, just perplexed. Next comment's Nasha Ginosh, 4570, 5 years ago. In Temagami, the little people and nets are similar. We put food out for them until the last 60 years. I'm not sure what she means by the nets are similar, but Temagami is like Lake Temagami. It's in northern Ontario. And I think there are quite a few little people stories set there, and other strange stories. Next comment's Robert Lambert, 7736, 3 years ago. A hunting trail I used in southern Ontario, in a heavily wooded old part of a creek system, had a large green rock on the hillside that just shouted, "Stay away from me." The north side was always clear to the ground. No leaves or twigs seemed to stay there. I would always stop there for a smoke break before continuing on, and for some reason, I always left a couple of smokes at the base of the rock. I never felt threatened there, just watched. I also noticed the small game trails that were everywhere else didn't seem to go within 100 yards of that rock. I always felt little people were there or something, with a keen understanding. I had no basis for it, I just felt that way. I'm not sure if this guy is native, but the practice of leaving tobacco for the little people is an ancient practice that I know for sure, like various Anishinaabe tribes did it, the Algonquins, the Cree, the Ojibwe, and I wouldn't be surprised if other nations did it too. A lot of times they would leave like tobacco at certain cliffs that the little people were supposed to live in, and the purpose was they thought that these little people, these little sprites, could control the weather on the water, and they wanted to have a safe journey. And so that's usually what the offerings were for. Next comment, Spencore 3 years ago. Thank you for making this video. It was incredibly informative and fascinating. I live in the southern city of Mississauga, Ontario, in Canada. We have a river here called the Credit River. It is an Ojibwe ceremonial site and old hunting ground. It has lots of ancient folklore and stories, including hairy, elf-like little people that lived around the river. If are interested in doing a part 2, let me know and I can help you get the info. Next comments, Carol Galt, 287, 7 months ago. I was at a women's retreat based on Aboriginal teachings. I had never heard of little people and had no clue whatsoever about their existence. Our last night there, while in a very powerful sweat lodge, I saw a little man at the entrance of the eastern side of the lodge. I saw him several times. The following day I was sharing my experience, as most of us do afterwards. Other women overheard me talking about my vision. Many women gathered around me, saying that I was blessed because of the little man that I saw. Most of them knew that little people exist, and they ranted and raved about how blessed I was, and how lucky I was to have had such a great experience. Thus my introduction to little people. Wow, isn't that something? So she saw one during a sweat lodge ceremony. Interesting, I've never heard of a story like that before. Next commenter is discovering Sasquatch cryptid 8973 1 year ago. A very nice commenter. She's left some very kind comments on my channel before. The little people are still in southern Ontario, Canada. I have personally captured them on film. No legend, they really do exist. There are many other cryptids here, including several that most are familiar with today. This is truth, because the structures they create and the beings themselves are being documented on film. Next comment's Jade Moon 7938 3 years ago. We have little people in my culture, the Anishinaabe. We call them Bagwajwi Anishinaabe, or Bagwajwi Nini. The story is basically they were Anishinaabe, but got lost and almost died. So they were turned into spirits, and now live happily in the forests, usually just outside human settlements. So they're people, but also something else. They look just like us, but they appear tiny, less than 6 inches tall, like someone shrunk them. We also have Memegwansawag. The Memegwans is a tiny spirit who is afraid of adults but likes kids. They appear as little people too, but they were never Anishinaabe. They've always been non-corporeal. These aren't European adoptions, they're part of our oral tradition, and early colonizers took these stories down, before we learned about fairies, elves, and leprechauns, etc. So she's making a distinction here between something else. The Memegwesawak is something I've covered a few times before. They're little hairy sprites that live in cliffs, and they're associated with water. But she's making a distinction between that and something she's calling the Bagwajwanini, which is people that got lost in the woods and became little spirits there. So that's interesting. So many of the little people stories from all over the world talk about how the little people will lure people into the woods, trap them there through deception, and then the people will eventually become like the little people themselves, which kind of accords with this Bagwajwanini story. Okay, let's go to the next one. Straw Jam 59 2 years ago. 1971, 15 miles south of Elsis, Ontario, on the Nemegosenda River, I saw one of these little things. I was 12 years old. I was real close to it. I'll never forget its face and the way it looked at me. It's a man of some sort, just different from us. I'm approaching 64 now, and sometimes think I just dreamed that day. I wish that were true. Great channel you have, by the way. Thank you. Let's check out Elsas, Ontario, because I don't know where that is. Okay, it looks fairly remote. It's deep in northern Ontario, kind of right smack in the middle of these two big highways by which you can travel from Ontario to the western provinces, which is, I guess, prime Memaguessoak territory, according to the local natives, I'm sure. Next comment's from Bread Toasted, 2269, 10 months ago. I believe I had an encounter with small people a few years ago, but I never saw them, just heard them. This happened on the res here in Canada, Ontario. Me and my cousin went for a drive one night, and just outside my town, my cousin glimpsed a small fire just a little way into the bushes, so she stopped and parked on the side of the road. I stepped out of the vehicle, and yes, she was right. There was a fire lit in the bushes. I walked into the bushes. When I finally reached the fire, it was a single log in a small clearing in the bushes. Only the full moon lit my path. I stood over the log, which was burning, and suddenly I heard what sounded like children laughing, but it sounded small. I immediately stomped the fire out with my boots. I yelled to the children not to play with fire, and that it was dangerous, and they should go home. Suddenly the fire was extinguished, and I lost the trail, and the moonlight seemed to disappear. I was deeper in the bushes, and it was pitch dark, and I heard my cousin honking the vehicle horns, and I followed the sound all the while I would hear laughter, which sounded like kids. I eventually saw the headlights from the vehicle, and my cousin calling my name. I made it back, and my cousin looked scared white. She lost me, she would later tell me. Wow, that's a crazy story. So that reminds me of, in the previous video on Western Canada stories, somebody had a very similar story about seeing like a tiny little fire flickering in the bushes that didn't spread to the surrounding foliage. It just kind of stayed there, amazingly. So this sounds very similar. And what it reminds me so much of is, there's stories of the Wills of the Wisp. Another one of these universal folk tales. People will see weird lights in the wilderness, and they'll follow them, and the lights seem to lead them astray, and then they'll go out, and leaving the people in darkness in maybe a very dangerous area where it's difficult to get back, always at nighttime. And these are associated with fairy stories. But in this case, the will-o'-the-wisp is literally a fire, a physical fire burning in the woods. Very, very interesting story. Next comment's Rob Comrie, 6186, 7 months ago. You don't have to go that far north to encounter little people. I have them on my land in southern Ontario. In the past, anytime I was cutting wood or clearing deadfalls on my land, and put my saw down to take a break, when I came back it would never start. Same with my tractor. So now when I do any cutting, I always leave a sugar cube or pipe tobacco, and guess what? No more problems. I told my young nephew about them, and he thought I was nuts until he encountered them. You can hear them singing, and when you approach the bus line, it stops. I told him they are trying to lure him into the woods, and not to enter unless he is with me. Needless to say, he is now a believer. Interesting, so this is a little person that lives on somebody's rural property, which reminds you a bit of the Lutah French-Canadian tradition, and the dwarves of Kashubian Canadian tradition in the Madawaska Highlands, that are supposed to be little, resident entities on, farms. And I think that's same with the Huldafolk in New Iceland. Next comment's Thomas Lietzau, 2813, 1 year ago. I was on a fire crew, fighting a forest fire west of Hudson Bay in Ontario, when we, the fire crew, encountered a tribe or village of what we called dirty little children, because that is what they looked like. They wore what looked like primitive Native American/Indian leather/buckskin outfits. They asked us what we were doing there. We responded, fighting the forest fire. They asked us if we needed anything for fighting the fire. I told them no, we were already being paid. They thanked us for our help, and then disappeared back into the forest. I asked my crew if they had just saw what had happened. Yes, they all had. That was the weirdest thing, and I still think about it 40-plus years later. Wow, interesting. Next comment's Christabella, WWMS, 2 years ago. In Picton Heights, my husband goes for night walks, and he just told me like a week ago he had seen a tiny little man run by fast as if it was gray, and he couldn't see a face. We were talking around 3 a.m. He told me about it, and I said, okay, weird. But then I saw this video, and I'm pretty surprised it is a thing. My husband is Indigenous. Makes you wonder, where is Picton Heights? Okay, looks like a little place, like a town on near the northeastern shores of Lake Ontario, not too far from Kingston, but on this kind of peninsula here. Okay, next comment is Gore Drilla 2 years ago. Driving down a side road near Red Bay, Ontario in Grey Bruce. I was a passenger, my wife driving, with my mom and niece on the back. I watched something strange for about 5 seconds before my wife slammed her brakes on and said the same thing as my niece. Did you see that? I said, don't say what you saw. Both of you say what you saw on the count of 3. I want to know if it's what I saw. At the count of 3, they both said, a little person riding a squirrel. That was exactly what I had watched for a few seconds before it cut across the road and the others saw it, except my mom. I had watched a red squirrel running along a very thick hedgerow, and with a tiny person riding on its back, as if it were a horse. Still to this day, my mind has issues trying to process what I had seen, even though it knows what I saw. I spoke to a local elder and told him what had happened. He said the reason why I probably saw it was that the hedgerow was too thick for it to go through, so it had to cut across the road. Absolutely wild. That's the first time I've heard of a little person riding a squirrel, but the French Canadians say that the louton, the little goblin that haunts farms, will take their horses out at night and ride them, and then return them all lathered in a sweat with little tiny braids in their manes and tails. But it's the first story I've heard about one riding a squirrel. Next comments, Ironwood Log Project 2 years ago. Interesting video. The only place where I saw a little man clear as day for a few seconds was on the southern outskirts of Algonquin Park, Ontario, back in 1986. He was only 6 inches tall, wore colorful garments and a pointed hat. He ran up to the long branch of a huge ironwood for 3 to 4 seconds, before disappearing in a flash of colorful rainbow sparks when he reached the tip of the branch. Then in 2016, a similar small man about the same size appeared next to me on a photo while doing an opening ceremony. He was wearing a white shirt. According to numerous sources, there seems to be different types of various sizes. The Algonquin call them Anishinaabemowin, while the Mi'kmaq know them as the Maga, and different stories describe them of different sizes. They say the first inhabitants made agreements with the little people concerning the caretaking of the forest and of its resources. So I'll say that the description of it wearing colorful garments and a pointed hat definitely accords with a lot of the European little people stories. Most of the native stories that I've heard describe them as wearing, skins, like buckskins, or tanned hides or something. But the colorful motley clothes and the pointed hat is definitely kind of a pan-European thing. Next comment, Cheryl Yurkowski, 2021, 1 year ago. I am an Anishinaabemowin. Something really trippy happened with this video when I overheard my boyfriend watching it. Cooking dinner in the kitchen, thought it was some video about Lord of the Rings, talking about elves and dwarves. Me and my boyfriend watch a lot of videos on the elves and the backgrounds of Silmarillion, etc. Until I heard the word Memagwesi. I came out of the kitchen, was like, whoa, I know of these oral stories. Many from my Discovering Rock Art by Thor Conway, which I obtained for a trade for Ojibwe Sky Star Map Constellation Guidebook, an introduction to Ojibwe star knowledge at Kino Mage Wapkong. The teaching rocks are commonly known as Peterborough petroglyphs. I turned to my boyfriend and said to him, a story I haven't shared with too many people in my life because I always thought they'd think it was made up or that I was crazy. When I was around 6 to 7 years old, my sister and I used to go up to Riviera Park in Lindsay, Ontario. It's a park that's on Scugog River. There are short trails all through the small woods there. My sister and I found a stream that led to a waterfall from a culvert coming out of a cliff edge. I was trailing behind my sister, trying to keep up with her. I looked down at the ground and saw a tiny little ladder made out of twigs. It looked like a tiny little fairy ladder. I went to get my sister and bring her back to show her it, but when I did, it was gone. I searched and searched around for it, knowing exactly where I saw it. I can still remember it vividly. After I told my boyfriend about it, I told him about how I knew about the Memagwesi. I then went back to cooking dinner and the video ended up playing out, with me hearing much of the rest. So after dinner, I went back to watch this video and listen to the rest of it. My boyfriend had fallen asleep at this point. Then at approximately 28 minutes, I hear the story being told about Dexter Amos's mother talking about miniature ladders in the woods while berry picking, but would be gone when she returned with the others. I woke my boyfriend up and said to him, WTF, I just told you about a story when I was little about the tiny ladder I once saw, but was gone when I went back to show my sister it, right? He replied, yeah. I grabbed the controller and went back to the video to 28 minutes and said to him, listen. It was exactly like I experienced when I was little. That's super cool. So she's referring to, there's a story from the Stoney, and I think it was Morley, Alberta. The Stoney are like kind of an offshoot of the Sioux, or more accurately, an offshoot of the Assiniboine. They live in the Rocky Mountains. And in the foothills, kind of west of Calgary, there's a city called Morley, and there's a story from a reservation called Morley, a Stoney reservation. And there's a story from there about somebody finding little ladders in the woods while berry picking that would vanish when they came to show people it. So she's got a story of a similar experience in Lindsay, Ontario, which I don't know where that is. Oh, okay. It says Kawartha Lakes, which is like north of Lake Ontario and east of Lake Simcoe, kind of directly north of Oshawa, between Lake Simcoe and Peterborough. Next comment's Michael Sheard, 4150, 1 year ago. I met one in Toronto's North End, between Keele and Dufferin, near Black Creek Pioneer Village, while walking home at night. It's true. It was hiding behind a shopping cart. They are real, and it's a weird feeling you get while looking at them, like we're supposed to walk right by without seeing them. It seems kind of strange to have a little person encounter in like a big city, but there are a few of them. There's one of them I covered before. Scarborough Sasquatch is a YouTube channel, and he has very interesting stories he's left on this channel before. And one of them he emailed to me about his own encounter with little people in Scarborough, which is a district of Toronto, which I'll link to my video that I've done on that before in the description. So it's not the first little people story set in a big city. Next comments, Gedu the Choppa 87, 1 year ago. This guy's from, he leaves some interesting comments. He's from Moosonee, Ontario, I believe. One of two commenters that always mention that they're from Moosonee, Ontario, which is a historic free settlement, I think. Fairly close to Hudson's Bay. I think just upriver from, is it the Moose River that drains into James Bay, I think? But he always leaves very interesting comments on this channel. And he says, I remember a story when my grandfather saw a man, was old and dirty looking, and we live in a small island, population 2,500, and my grandfather never saw him before. The man approached my grandpa. My grandpa felt the man had bad intentions. He started to approach my grandpa, until my grandpa raised his axe. Then the dirty wild man, my grandpa called him, started to back off into the bushes. My grandparents lived long lives and had stories. Granny, 1922 to 2017, age 96, and Grandpa, 1920 to 2023, age 103. Wow, that's old. So I don't know if this is a little person story. I should have maybe filed this in the wild man category, but still a interesting story nonetheless. A dirty wild man who approached his grandpa. Oh, and we've got some more here from Discovering Sasquatch Cryptid 8973, 1 year ago. The little people are still in southern Ontario, Canada. I have personally captured them on film. No legend, they really do exist. There are many other cryptids here, including several that most are familiar with today. This is the truth because the structures they create and the beings themselves are being documented on film. I'm sorry about the repetition. It's an almost identical comment earlier. And she has one here again 5 months ago. My mother told me about the little people and the werewolf who were known about where she grew up in the Gaspé, Quebec. She used the same words to describe these two, Luton and Rougarou or Lougarou. She told me this in 1970, after I had seen the famous Bluff Creek video and asked her about Bigfoot. I can tell you that we do indeed have little people and the fairy folk in southern Ontario. I have video recorded of them here. We have Dogman and Sasquatch here, as well as cryptids of many varieties in southern Ontario, Canada. I really enjoy your channel because you're sharing what I know is truth. Thank you. So her mother has stories of little people and werewolves from Gaspé, Quebec, which is like, I think on the southern shores of the St. Lawrence Delta, or I guess you'd call it like the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the part that kind of juts out at the very mouth of the river on the southern end, which is, I think, very historically French, or French-Canadian, I should say. Next comments, Angel Cadieu, 1972, 11 months ago. And she's got two comments here. Aurelia, Ontario, Canada, 2009. My son was 3. He ran in my room so fast, terrified, saying goblin monsters. He said one was on the stairs, another in the bathroom. He said they were small with pointy ears. I see nothing. He's 18 today and doesn't remember. And then she says part 2. One night, 2009, my son, 3 years old, were in my room watching TV. I had taken the double doors off the closet to make the room look bigger. I had lots of clothes hanging in there. He told me something was looking at us from in there. I didn't see nothing. Just changed the topic, talking about what we were watching on TV. Hard to know what to think with stories like this, because we all know little kids have very powerful imaginations, and they can come up with elaborate stories that I think they believe, that are kind of based on misperception. But at the same time, you hear stories of little kids have the ability to see ghosts in a way that many adults can't. So maybe, I don't discount the idea at all that little children, just like maybe dogs, have an ability to see things that most adults can't, like to peer through whatever veil separates us from the invisible world, if that makes sense. So hard to know what to think with the stories like this, but they're interesting nonetheless. So let's go to the next one. Lauren Boucher, 6046, 2 days ago. I have a story of my experience with them, and it can be heard on the podcast Astonishing Legends. The episode is called Le Nain Rouge. When I was a young kid fishing in the spring with my dad, I saw one. I told my great-grandma, and she told me they were good spirits and protectors. Later she told my uncle used to see and play with them by the river behind her house. This was near Parry Sound, Ontario. Now, Parry Sound, is that where my friend Bex Coral lives? I think it is. Or used to live, I should say, her family home. And she has a very interesting story she told me about a little person that, it's like a family story. I think it comes from, oh boy, I want to say Newfoundland, somewhere in eastern Canada. Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. I'm sorry, Bex, I can't recall. But there's her great-grandfather or something had this encounter with a little person, and ever since then, family tradition had it that this little guy would be living in their home and kind of following them, and she thinks it followed her family to Ontario. And there was something like, I think on her birthday, oh man, I can't quite recall the story, but she would see, or little coins would appear in the house, like clockwork. Every year they'd appear in some kind of hidden place, little coins. And I don't know if Bex was aware of this when she told me the story, but that is exactly the sort of story that from southern Ontario, there's, I think it's in Oxford and Waterloo counties, a lot of Cornish people settled there, like English people from Cornwall. And they'd have stories about pixies. And I think they were under the impression that these things had followed them from the old world to Ontario, and the pixies would leave coins for people. That was what these Cornish Canadians said. So we've got 2 stories of little people from Parry Sound, Ontario.
This is a quick edit post-production. I'm mistaken. Bex's encounter happened in Port Perry, and that's Port Perry, which is a town on Lake Scugog, not too far from where the previous Kawartha Lakes experience happened. Parry Sound is on the shores of Georgian Bay. I actually drove past here once in my cube van on my way back from picking up Gary Munja-Coper's files, and it's kind of right where the Canadian Shield begins. And I've covered it before. There's a story about a lady in white, like a ghost story from there. And there's also an old native little person story from Parry Sound, which I covered in a previous video. I'll link to both of my videos on those topics in the description. But another thing I wanted to mention, which I just thought of, was kind of an interesting connection in Indonesian folklore and I think Malaysian folklore. There is a little person called a tuyul. Now, I don't know if you would lump this in with little people because it's a little bit different, but this is like an entity that you summon. I think you have to go up a mountain and you bring a bottle with you, and through some black magic you will get this thing to come inside your bottle, and it looks like a little baby with green skin. And what it's supposed to do is it will leave your house and grab money from other houses and come back and bring you money. It'll go to your neighbors and steal their money and bring it to you. And in return, it's going to suckle on the teat, if you're a woman, on yours, or if you're a man, the closest woman in your life, like your wife or your mother maybe, or your sister. And instead of drinking milk, it'll drink blood. And what happens is the person to whom this happens will kind of become very skinny, and if this goes on indefinitely, they're going to die. So that's the price paid for having a tuyul come and steal your money. Anyway, just an interesting connection.
Next comments, Thomas Lietzau, 2813. Oh, this is the guy before who had seen the little dirty children while fighting a forest fire. So let's read it again here. This is a new comment. I was on a fire crew west of the southern tip of Hudson Bay back in the 1990s when we meet up with little people. They wore old-style Native American dress. We told they were there to stop the forest fire heading this way. They asked if we needed anything. I said no need, but thanked them. They thanked us for saving their home. We saw them from time to time watching us. They seemed curious about our helicopter. They seemed very friendly. Next comments, James Borg, 333 Maya, 4 months ago. Great video. In Parry Sound, Ontario, famous author Terry Boyle, rest in peace, said he had them on his property. I also took a picture of one of them running away in Drummond Cemetery in Niagara Falls, Ontario. So a third story from Parry Sound, Ontario. Terry Boyle's an author. He wrote about ghost stories. And I don't know if you remember, there was, if you're Canadian and you're a certain age, you might remember there was a TV program. I can't remember which channel this was on, but it was called Creepy Canada. And they used to cover kind of ghost stories, mostly ghost stories, but sometimes other stories of strange phenomena, monster stories, set like around Canada. And Terry Boyle was the host of this show. So he said he had one on his property. I have to read more of his books. I haven't read, I think I read one of them, but I have to read more. Next comments, Darren Milbury, 3621, 4 months ago. I'm on the Atikamek Anishinabek Reserve, and I was told that there are some here, too, on the reserve. Okay, where's this? Okay, north of Lake Huron, very close to Sudbury. Next comments, Canadian Shuffle, 5 months ago. I remember playing with them as a kid in southern Ontario forest. We were climbing up hills covered in roots, and laughing the entire time. They disappeared when the sun started to set. That's a theme you hear sometimes, like they play with little children. Next comments, Yannick Bellinger, 8951, 5 months ago. Outside the village of Radisson in northern Quebec, in the woods as a child, I found a tiny house. I was a big boy at 9, but this hut was small for me. A rock, wood stove, tiny table, and chairs. What really hit home were the cup-sized plates and an inch-long cutlery. It really freaked me out, and I told no one ever. I made a point of never going there again. Sorry, I kind of filed this a little bit too early, but it's in Quebec. In the woods, he found a tiny house. Interesting. Next comments, Evil Alien, 1741, 5 months ago. I just saw 2 of them in Manitoba Island area. One was peeking out from a tree, and the other was going a weird wiggle dance about 3 foot tall. It vanished into nothing when my friend ran towards it. They apparently bug the neighbors and run around the property line and turn on the sensor lights and move things. They know that you see them and run around. They never break anything or hurt anyone. So on Manitoba Island, that's a very large island in Lake Huron, I think. I think it's the largest freshwater island in the world. And it's fairly close to the last story, or one of the previous stories about the reserve near Sudbury. Next comments, Alien Girl 77, 5 months ago. I'm from a reserve in northwestern Ontario, and growing up, we'd hear of locals who reported seeing them from time to time. Sadly, we don't hear of any sightings anymore. Last one over a dozen years ago. I think something in the water or environment killed them off. So another story from a reserve. And I think we're going to get the same thing here in the next comment. 6 Nations, Wahoo, 188, 5 months ago. They're here, brother. My grandfather and my uncle Teddy used to see them around the res 6 Nations. Another res story. Next comments, Pete McLean, 1352, 5 months ago. I've only heard broken second or third hand stories, but Hammerson should look into legends of the Rock people in the Armstrong area of Ontario. It said they usually make themselves known to children, and apparently they attempt to play and lure children away into the bush. Apparently they're child-sized, and they look as if they're made of rock. I've personally only been to Armstrong once, and didn't see any rock people or any little people, but there is something just off about that town. While there, I saw no birds other than ravens and crows, a town close to lakes in all directions, and I didn't see a seagull, didn't hear a loon or a duck, goose, or even tweedy songbirds. Nothing but crows and ravens. On the telephone wires, in the trees, on the fences and roofs, on the streets, they were everywhere. There were also like 100 stray dogs in town. Meanwhile, each yard has at least one dog tied up in it. Like WTF. I had to load a piece of equipment in a gravel pit out in the bush a bit, south of Armstrong, right around midnight. Other than the headlights of my truck and the lights of the loader I was hauling, the entire area was just black, no moon, no stars, just black beyond the edge of my lights. The entire time I was in that gravel pit, I could not shake that I'm being watched feeling, and it was a strong feeling. I've only been to Armstrong once, but that place is just unsettling. I grew up in the bush of northwest Ontario. I also happened to be Status Ojibwe. I'm normally right at home in the bush, day or night, but that place just gave me a get-out-of-here feeling, right from the moment I arrived. So bad vibes in Armstrong. Where's Armstrong? Okay, it looks fairly remote, northwest of Lake Nipigon. Actually quite remote. So interesting he talked about the rock people. I've never heard of that in relation to little people, but the Iroquois people, the different Iroquois nations have stories about the rock people, and I've never done a video on them yet. But my impression, it was more like a wild man story, like a giant story. I think they call them rock giants. But I don't want to talk about that too much because I've only read it a little bit in some of the old ethnologies, but I haven't really done a video on it yet. Anyway, let's go to the next one. Oh, A Girl Has No Name, 1422. We covered her story before, but this is a comment 5 months ago. She says, in the late 70s, when I was a small child, my cousin's aunt and uncle had an old house with quite a bit of property on Lake Ontario in Burlington. The property dropped off to a cliff that went down to the lake. My uncle had made a narrow path that you could go down to the lake on. We saw several times these little beings on the property, and they were very interested in my cousins and I. My aunt and 16-year-old cousin also saw them diving into the water. There were strange things that happened in that house, things going missing and found later elsewhere, and the sound of giggling children when my cousins and I were asleep. This video just answered many of my questions about them. So the things going missing in the house and being found later is, we talked about this before, it's a theme in, for sure, Hulda stories from New Iceland, and also fairy stories from Newfoundland. And the sound of giggling children, that's, we've seen that pop up a few times in this video already. Next comments, Monsieur Ladoucier, 1534, 5 months ago. One time, I saw a leprechaun in Peterborough, Ontario. That's it. Which reminds me of Scarborough Sasquatch Station's comment, and just so happens that he is commenting next. Scarborough Sasquatch Station, 1403, 5 months ago. Incredible. It's now been more than 50 years that have lapsed since I first encountered the little people, who also lived inside via a portal on the old brick wall, in a schoolyard near Dufferin and Bloor Streets, Toronto, Ontario. Story has been previously told by Hammerson Peters. I'll include a link to that video in the description. Next comments, Master Elixtress, 3 months ago. I was hiking in Algonquin 2 summers ago, and saw a little man hiding among some ferns. He was no taller than 8 or 9 inches, and wore dark brown clothing. I went to tell my friend to look, but when we turned around, he was gone. So in Algonquin Provincial Park, I'm sure that's what that is. Wearing dark brown clothing. Next comments, Blue Fairy, 3 months ago. I had an encounter with the little people. I was sitting in my garden one evening. There was a whole group of them in different areas of my wild natural gardens. They came to thank me for the lovely gardens I provided, and for the gifts that I often put out for them. I lived in Ontario, in a small town north of Toronto. And we've got A Girl Has No Name, 1422, again, commenting 3 months ago. I live in Toronto, but my aunt had a house right on Lake Ontario when I was a child, on the Oakville-Burlington border. My cousins and I used to see these little people looking in the bedroom window from a tree next to it. We weren't scared. They seemed curious of us, and us of them. The next one's the last Ontario story. Here in northwestern Ontario, my grandpa's brother or my great-uncle once saw a little man 3 feet tall, standing on the bank of a creek. He said he wore work boots and a checkered jacket, much like a logger of the day. Once the little man noticed that he was discovered, he jumped into the creek. I believe they still live there, not too far from my house. 2 hunters saw what looked like a gorilla walking on all fours, crossing Kings Highway 71 about 10 years ago. It stopped at the edge of the bush, turned and looked at them. They shot directly at it, but the bullets seemed to pass right through it. They went to a shaking tent to ask the spirits what it was they saw. The spirit of that gorilla-looking creature spoke to them. He told them that there were 2 kinds, 2 foot tall, 4 foot tall, 6 foot tall like this creature, and 8 foot tall, Sasquatch. You don't need to know who I am. I can appear and disappear at will. You can never harm us, the spirit creature said. The hunters felt much better knowing something at least. Interesting story. Now we're into Quebec. And it looks like there's only one story from Quebec, from the real Mr. Bitcoin 4081 5 years ago. I am Métis from northern Quebec, and my grandfather told me of these very small people. I believe it very ignorant for us to think we know everything in this world. I totally agree. And now we're into the Maritimes. First comments from Audrey Grenier, 1981, 3 years ago. Hi there, very interesting series. Just wanted to say I am from Cape Breton Island, and we too have old Gaelic and Mi'kmaq stories about fairies/little people, dating back centuries. Stories that our ancestors brought with them from the old country have endured throughout the tests of time. Generation after generation of Cape Breton Gaels tell of encounters with the little people of the wood. The old people used to tell how when they journeyed across the sea, the changelings followed them to the New World. The Mi'kmaq of Cape Breton, who have inhabited the lands and islands of the Maritimes for tens of thousands of years, they too have changeling stories, which coincides with the lore of the Gaels. It seems these two cultures share a great deal in common concerning folklore and legends. Anyway, I love your channel, and hope you continue your interesting content. So Cape Breton Island is, it's like a very large island north of Nova Scotia. It's in Nova Scotia. It's part of Nova Scotia, but it's north of the Nova Scotian Peninsula. Fairly rugged, covered with trees, and it has the Cape Breton Highlands and a big lake called Labrador Lake. And Audrey's saying how the local Gaelic legends and the Mi'kmaq legends kind of mesh. And that's something I found too. These little people stories, no matter their origin, are very similar, eerily similar. Next comments, Masaha Ru Morimoto, 4761, 3 years ago. Yo, Grandma told me stories about the little people of PEI, Prince Edward Island. We are from Cape Breton area, and I totally remember thinking the little people were real. Every summer we went to Rainbow Valley, and of course camped in the 1980s. I tried to sneak out of the tent and look for little people. So I don't know where Rainbow Valley is. Let me check it out. Okay, looks like it's from Prince Edward Island, from Cavendish. The author Louis Maud Montgomery, I think, based her Avonlea, which is the setting of her famous book, Anne of Green Gables, on Cavendish. And if you go there, there's the Anne of Green Gables house, and some of the, like the Haunted Wood, some of the things from the Anne of Green Gables books. But Prince Edward Island has both Mi'kmaq and, I guess you'd call it like Euro-Canadian stories of little people. I've covered them in my documentary on the legends of PEI, and I'll link to that in the description. Next comments, J.F. Kelly, 506, 1 year ago. Hanging out with Mi'kmaq natives, they seem to describe the little people as sort of custodians of the forest. Cheers from New Brunswick. Next comments, Madison Morell, 4336, 1 year ago. Hello from New Brunswick, Canada. My grandfather is from Newfoundland, and he told me when we would walk back to his house from his grandmother's, she would make him take a piece of bread in his pocket to protect him from the fairies. Those traditions have continued on. There's no place I'd rather be. That is a very common theme in Newfoundland fairy stories. They say that if you want to protect yourself from a fairy, you keep a piece of bread in your pocket, and if they ever bother you, you just chuck it at them, and they'll leave you alone. Oh, here's another comment from Audrey Grenier, 1981, 1 year ago. I love your little people videos. The topic is so interesting. I'm from Cape Breton, and fondly remember listening to the stories told in Gaelic and Acadian French of the Fae of Nova Scotia, and how they followed our people here from the old country. So thank you for the content. Next comment's 420 YOLO Swag for Jesus, 1 year ago. Wiklat Muj, the little people in Mi'kmaq. Cool video. Next comment's Mi'kmaq Empress, Kuju, 85, 1 year ago. Born and raised in Mi'kmaq here. Other Mi'kmaq communities call my community Land of the Little People. I remember when I was really little, I would see them. When I tried telling an adult, they'd say that I had a big imagination. But then when I was 8 to 10 years old, I started learning about them in Eskasani. But when I went back home, I never saw them again. Not that I recall, anyways. Next one's Tal Boner, 1 year ago. In Mi'kmaq, we call them Buglat Muj. So a few different names for them in Mi'kmaq. I should have explained, Mi'kmaq are a First Nation from the Maritimes, from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. And, Mi'kmaq Empress Kiju 85 is another comment 5 months ago. Over here in Mi'kmaqi. Oh, sorry, I must have pronounced that wrong in the other video. It sounds like a settlement or something. Us Mi'kmaq also have stories of legends of the little people. Wutalatmu is what we call them in our language. Spelling may not be right. Okay, so that's interesting. Just compare that with the previous comment, Buglatmuj and Wutulatmu. It sounds similar. And there's many stories of them braiding the hairs of horses, and sometimes the people. My people are called People of the Dawn, but my community is known for short people. It's kind of funny. My children are not short, but I am. And now we're going to Newfoundland, which I think is the last section that I've covered here. Newfoundland has tons of fairy stories, but strangely, I just have 2 comments here that I've on my channel about. Newfoundland fairy encounters. But let's take a look. First comments, Earthbound 369 3 years ago. I spent a summer in Newfoundland with my girlfriend, who was from there. We were blueberry picking, when she told me the story of her great aunt, who went blueberry picking after twilight. Never go out at twilight. Sometime in the 1940s. She didn't come home for 2 nights. Couldn't explain what happened. She remained distracted and simple-like for the rest of her life. Oh, and her hair turned white. Her family was firmly convinced the fairies took her. Even my girlfriend, who I met at college, had her doubts. So that is a completely classic fairy story from Newfoundland. Going berry picking at twilight, being captured by the little people for a couple nights, coming back, and being fundamentally changed for the worse, mentally, and having her hair turned white. These are all, it's like somebody took all the common themes from Newfoundland fairy stories and put them into one story, but I'm not saying I don't believe this story at all. It's just a classic, quintessential Newfoundland fairy story, which is super cool, especially to hear from somebody who's not from Newfoundland. Last story is a local cryptid 2 years ago. 2 years late on this, but hello, I'm from the Labrador portion of Newfoundland in Labrador. So the Labrador portion is on the mainland. My grandmother always told me about the fairies back home, sometimes appearing as black-eyed children. And if you were unlucky, you would be fairy blasted. The end result of a fairy blast is a gaping wound, where the attack landed, and instead of blood, sewing supplies, needles, thread, thimbles, etc., would pour out. Of course, you could avoid this by carrying bread, which seems to be the general consensus across the province. So fairy blast, this is something I want to do a video on sometime, because it's one of those weird universal folk tales where other traditions have stories of something similar, but they attribute it to something different. So a fairy blast in Newfoundland fairy lore is somebody will go into like a marsh or something, or a berry patch, and they think the fairies will shoot them with like an arrow or something. And they'll develop this kind of lump on their skin, and like the guy said, instead of normal things coming out of it, he says it'll be sewing supplies like needles, thread, thimbles. I've read that sometimes grass will come out, sometimes feathers will come out, twigs, stuff like that has no business being inside your body will come out of this kind of lump. And if you're attacked, if you have a fairy blast, sometimes it'll cause mental problems as well. But there are other kind of very similar stories, I think, in native legend. And one of these days, if I get the chance, I want to do a video kind of comparing the different stories that are so similar. And I think that's the end of it. So we've covered the entire country, little people stories from across Canada. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.